Some say that SCP-2102 was a mistake, an abomination created by an accident of medical science. Maybe those people are right. Maybe there's much more to it than that. Either way, they don't know the full story. How could they? They weren't there. They weren't there all the way back in 1972. But Dr. Pavel Zukal was. The earliest moments, the events that directly preceded SCP-2102's creation began on March 2nd. The wind was carrying an unforgiving, freezing bite with it as Zukal made his way to the Institute of Experimental Medicine, ZISAV, in Czechoslovakia. With the Cold War between the USSR and the United States underway, there was already an air of secrecy on both sides. Espionage and intelligence-gathering operations were rampant, bringing with them paranoia and distrust. There was no way of knowing if someone was a double agent, leaking information to the West. But while the governments of Russia, America, and their various respective allies and enemies scrambled for control and amassed obscene quantities of nuclear arms in secret, there were even more cogs turning, hidden in the deepest, darkest shadows. The SCP Foundation's long-standing rivalry with various other groups of interest was well known among any with a high enough security clearance. Most of these groups were radicals or outliers, despite possessing knowledge of anomalies or even being directly linked to them. A lot of GOIs were independent of any world government. But for decades, the Foundation had been aware of a directly competing establishment, effectively a parallel of their own organization on the other side of the globe. They were known as GRU Division P, a USSR equivalent of the SCP Foundation themselves. It is unclear based on what was recovered from Dr. Zukal's personal diary if he had been directly scouted by GRU Division P for their project in Czechoslovakia. Given the air of secrecy engulfing the USSR at the time, it is possible that Pavel himself had no inclination that Division P was even involved in the project, due to take place at the Institute of Experimental Medicine. He might have suspected, but with no way of knowing for sure. Similarly, there was no way Zukal could have known where the project would lead, what he would have a hand in creating. The initial few weeks after his arrival at the Institute were rocky, to say the least. Zukal, along with a team of scientists and technicians working on orders direct from Moscow, had to contend with unreliable equipment and difficulty getting electricity to power the project. Eventually, after clearing those initial hurdles, testing could begin. But what was the goal of this mysterious project? Well, through Zukal, GRU Division P and the Kremlin were chasing something the scientific world has been trying to accomplish for decades. Something that could change the very landscape of not only the Cold War, but the entirety of modern medicine, the secrets of cellular regeneration. Unlocking that would, in theory, enable them to create the world's very first unkillable super soldier. And hey, it definitely wouldn't be the craziest secret operation carried out by a world superpower during the Cold War. The CIA spent millions turning a cat into a listening device and training it to infiltrate enemy headquarters. This so-called acoustic kitty was struck and killed by a random van during its first mission. Compared to that, a cell-regenerating super soldier was positively sensible. With a worldwide nuclear arms race already underway, perhaps the project's ultimate goal was to produce an entire army of these self-regenerating troops. With something like that in their hands, the USSR would have the manpower to reinforce their nuclear arsenal, and potentially even soldiers capable of surviving and healing from the effects of an atomic blast. On the 5th of May 1972, the first of the project's human test subjects began to show promising results. They underwent physical trauma at the hands of Zukal and the other scientists, only for their bodies to react much faster than the ordinary healing process would allow. Rapid clotting took place in the affected areas, preventing the subjects from bleeding out. However, this quickly went awry. The clots turned into severe lesions. Realizing this had occurred thanks to Macaulay, one of the other project scientists administering too much neodymium, Zukal chastised his colleague, vowing him to drag him to Moscow personally if another mistake like that ever took place again. Unfortunately, by the last few days of June, Dr. Zukal and his team were no closer to success. Every subject that underwent testing succumbed to the same necrosis. Reducing the amount of neodymium had only made the reaction worse, something Pavel couldn't allow Macaulay to know without the risk of it being held over his head for the remainder of the project. In every instance, the doctors were able to trigger rapid cell division, 50 times faster than that which occurs in the ordinary healing process of human beings. But the biggest drawback was that this division would quickly become uncontrollable. It was creating enough new matter on a cellular level that it would choke each test subject in its own excess waste. As you might expect, Dr. Zukal noted this in his diary that this process wasn't a pretty sight. Come mid-August 1972, the project scientists decided they needed a test subject with more resilience than the average person, and a suitable candidate was provided. He was a counter-revolutionary who had been sentenced to 15 years in a uranium mine as a punishment detail. Despite such an extended period of time under the harsh conditions of the mine and the close proximity to a radioactive element such as uranium, the man managed to survive unscathed. Upon closer examination, this new guinea pig, referred to as X16, had a rate of healing twice as fast as that of an average man. Perhaps it was a random genetic abnormality that made X16 this way, or maybe it was a result of his extensive time in the uranium mines. Either way, it made him the perfect new subject for Zukal's experiments. Initially, subject X16's preliminary testing results looked promising. The wound healing process was actually taking place now, instead of resulting in necrosis or aborting it as it had with the earlier experiments. In fact, Dr. Zukal seemed to think X16 was healing almost too quickly. But nevertheless, testing continued, although not without a different type of problem. The questionable morality of what they were doing began to set in for Pavel, causing him nights of endless tossing and turning, unable to sleep as he reflected on what he'd done. X16 had managed to survive for much longer than the earlier test subjects, but it was clear that the torture this man had to endure was exacting a heavy toll. Every day, the doctors would lacerate him, time and time again, recording the results. And every day, he survived, only for the cycle to begin again the next day. For his own part, Zukal was conflicted. On the one hand, the results of the testing were proving successful, lasting far longer and working far more effectively than they had in the past, and yet on the other, it came at the cost of one man's continued suffering. To make matters worse, Pavel had no way of voicing his concerns to any of his team. Any questioning of his orders or the project's methods would have been viewed by GRU Division P and the KGB as sedition and treason, earning the good doctor a one-way ticket to a gulag, or, if he was lucky, a clean shot to the back of the head from an agent's pistol. Often morality is sacrificed for the greater good, in the pursuit of the advancement of science or a nation's goals. But now that the project was showing results with X16, now that it was real, what they were doing still weighed heavily on Dr. Zukal's conscience. Then, on October 15, 1972, the final piece of the puzzle seemed to become clear. By introducing the correct amount of stabilizing agent into the serum they had concocted, Zukal and his team had perfected the composition. Upon administering this newly completed version of the solution, the doctor noted in his diary that subject X16 was responding well. At least, medically, the subject was responding well. It was clear that the continuous experimentation he had been subjected to was causing uncooperative behavior in X16. But so close to the cusp of achieving the project's goals, Dr. Zukal was quick to cast aside his previous doubts about the ethics of their methods. They were so close to victory, so close to the project being over, that it no longer mattered how cooperative X16 was being. But 2 weeks and 4 days later, just as the project was nearing its end goal, disaster struck. MU Dr. Elena Orakova was one of the scientists on Zukal's team, who had primarily helped when examining the early cell divisions, those that were leading to necrosis and causing test subjects to produce too much excessive genetic material. Elena had made a startling discovery and immediately brought it to Dr. Zukal in a distraught show of panic. The cell samples they had used to test their serum were now gaining mass, seemingly from nowhere. Just like the earlier experiments, the effects were working almost too well, causing an overabundance of cellular regeneration to the point where the cells couldn't stop producing masses of waste genetic material. When Zukal brought Elena's findings to Drs. Sislard and one Georgy T. Fedinko, the project heads assigned by Division P, they were quick to disregard it as an error, determining to press on with the project to meet their deadline. Over the course of the following weeks, up to late November, Zukal was trying to determine what was causing this change. It was clear that unless he and Elena could resolve the issues with the serum, Subject X-16 would be a total failure. But time was running out, with their superiors at GRU Division P and the Kremlin expecting results by early December. Under untold amounts of pressure and subsequent stress, Dr. Pavel Zukal found himself losing time, unable to sleep to the point where he was drifting off whenever he was on the verge of a breakthrough. By the end, Elena was the only member of the team trying to help him methodically figure out what had gone wrong. The deadline for the project arrived on December 2nd, 1972. Pavel didn't sleep all night leading up to it, knowing he would have to present a functioning super soldier to GRU Division P. In the best case, he was risking being accused of negligent failure, forced to restart the project from scratch, making his months of hard work redundant. But worst case scenario, Zukal could be charged with treason for having not completed the task he was selected for. On the 2nd of December, he wrote, "I really don't know which is better. Tomorrow is a day too." Nobody knows if Dr. Pavel Zukal lived to see that tomorrow. His final diary entry was made on the day SCP-2102 was born. For months, the SCP Foundation had operatives embedded within the Czechoslovakian government as part of innumerable Cold War espionage gathering efforts. During that time, their agents had gathered enough intelligence to make the Foundation aware of a GRU Division P project based at the Institute of Experimental Medicine, and that the scientists there were looking to unlock the secret of rapid cellular regeneration. Someone, possibly even one of Zukal's team, had managed to infiltrate the project and had leaked documents to the SCP Foundation, explaining what was going on in Czechoslovakia. The plan was that the Foundation would move in secret of course, to extract and contain test subject X-16 in January of 1973. That day would never come to fruition though. On the 2nd of December, only a month before they had planned to act, the Foundation became aware of a catastrophe occurring at the Institute of Experimental Medicine. One of their agents in Czechoslovakia alerted them to a disturbance that had caused civilians and scientists alike to run from the institute in fear for their lives. Something had gotten loose, and the Foundation had to act fast. Luckily, a reconnaissance team was stationed in Eastern Europe. Members of various mobile task forces who had been spying on GRU Division P and the rest of the USSR. Moving quickly, the recon team was deployed to Czechoslovakia. Led by a field commander named Merrick, they were given the objective to determine the cause of the situation and, if possible, recover its anomalous source. Merrick and the recon team arrived on site at the Institute's grounds. The entrance to the bunker which had been housing the project was left wide open, with not a soul in sight. As the team progressed further, Merrick couldn't help but notice a pungent smell permeating the labs and offices that they passed. Foundation Command urged their operatives to proceed cautiously and recover any paperwork they could. Among the logistical documents was a diary belonging to one of the scientists, although the name Pavel Zukal on the cover was no longer legible, forever lost. The further he and the other MTF agents progressed, the worse the smell got. They located an elevator, deciding to take it down to the lower levels of the bunker. One by one, the team filed in, Merrick radioing command. "Command, any seismic activity in the area?" he asked. Not that we know of, Merrick," came the Foundation's reply. "Why?" I think I just felt something move down there." The elevator had barely descended a foot before it hit something, stopping in an instant. As Merrick tried once again to contact Foundation Command, that same something came tearing through the elevator floor. Over the radio, the SCP Foundation were treated to a cacophony of screeching, tearing metal, along with the screams of their own men. What Merrick and his team had encountered may have once been a man, perhaps someone subjected to cruelty and torture, but now all they saw was an amorphous, fleshy mass. Immediately, the recon team opened fire, engaging what they assumed was a raging monster. It probably never occurred to them that they might have just wanted to be free after years of imprisonment, followed by months of horrendous experiments. Minutes later, Merrick was able to get in contact with Command again, locked in a heated battle with the entity. But every round fired, every shot their guns landed, nothing was having any effect. Whenever Merrick dealt damage to the creature, part of it seemed to grow, faster and faster each time. Their guns were useless, unable to stop the expanding monstrous test subject. Even grenades thrown by the MTF operatives, causing multiple explosions, did little to stop the entity in its tracks. Listening in over the radio, knowing they had few options left, the SCP Foundation dispatched a pair of F-4 Phantoms, long-range supersonic fighter jets, equipped with a payload of M47A1 napalm incendiary bombs. With Merrick and his men almost on the ropes, command issued an order to retreat. They fled the bunker, only to feel the ground shake beneath their feet. The monster had breached the topsoil, still coming after them. Jones, one of the Foundation's agents, was pulled under the encroaching shapeless mass, crushed to death as it continued its pursuit. Utterly horrified at the sight and speed of the creature, Merrick started begging command over the radio to get its fighter jets to the scene. 6 minutes later, the sound of twin turbine engines shot through the air, followed by the whistle of bombs careening down towards the ground. In a second, Merrick, his team, and the creature were engulfed in a fiery explosion, the heat proving enough to cauterize the fleshy abomination's expanding tissue. Ever since December 1972, the entity now designated as SCP-2102 has been housed at Site-122, contained by the SCP Foundation. They keep it in a modified cell, restrained at all times with its hands and feet in padded sleeves. This is done in order to prevent the risk of injury, either accidental or intentional, given both SCP-2102's anomalous properties and its self-destructive tendencies. Its body is covered in scars, both from its previous escape attempts, back when it was known as Subject X-16, and from burns from the F-4 Phantom's napalm payload. These particular injuries seared the entity's ears, mouth, and eyes closed, rendering it deaf, mute, and blind. If SCP-2102 ever suffers any form of external injury, its anomalous properties will trigger. The creature, as you might have guessed, possessed an advanced form of cellular healing, able to regenerate from all wounds inflicted on it. However, the process was never perfected. It still works too well. So well that SCP-2102's cells don't know when to stop. Instead, they continue producing bodily tissue, expanding its mass into every available space without a halt. The process can be slowed if an obstacle is introduced, boxing in the exponentially growing tissue. However, any object or person in its path is eventually crushed under the mounting pressure. At present, the Foundation still has no idea how much SCP-2102's tissue could expand, potentially even posing a risk to the entire world if left unchecked. There is only one surefire way to stop the creature's healing. It can only be halted by cauterizing the open wound with intense heat. It's literally a surefire solution. SCP-2102 is a result of the good Dr. Zukal's work, combined with his and GRU Division P's willingness to put aside their morality. They didn't create an undying, regenerating super soldier for the USSR as they had intended. Instead, all they accomplished was turning a tortured man into a monster, an abomination endlessly tormented by the experiments performed on him. Not quite as useful on the battlefield, is it? Now go check out SCP-049 the Plague Doctor and SCP-847 the Mannequin for more stories of medically macabre monstrosities sure to make your blood run cold.